Hello, everybody. Hey, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We at Left Bank Books are delighted to welcome Anna Zivarts, author and disability advocate, to celebrate the fantastic new book, When Driving is Not an Option, Steering Away from Car Dependency. We're also happy to be joined by Kia Wilson tonight, a writer and Left Bank Books alum. I'm so very happy to see you here. Let's give them a warm welcome. And thank you all so much for coming tonight. We really appreciate having you all here, whether in person or online. If you are online, thank you for joining us, wherever you may be. You can participate in the Q&A at the end of the event by typing your question as a comment, and I'll read it. So thank you for being here. Everybody, we really appreciate your attendance tonight. When you shop at Left Bank Books and attend our events, your money stays directly in our local economy. So it funds vital infrastructure, it makes our parks amazing, our libraries, museums, everything that makes St. Louis a great place. That is all part of one system. So thank you so much for shopping local and for joining us here tonight. We always have tons of events planned, usually multiple a week, so there's always something for everybody. Left-bank.com, you can check out our full calendar of upcoming events. And now for tonight. As I said, Kia Wilson is our conversation partner tonight. Kia is a novelist, teaching artist, and a writer, currently working with Streets Blog USA. Kia lives in St. Louis, and we've also got one of her books for sale. Anna Zivarts is a low-vision mom and non-driver who was born with a neurological condition by 7 months. Since launching the Disability Mobility Initiative at Disability Rights Washington in 2020, Anna has worked to bring the voices of non-drivers to the planning and policy-making tables through organizing, research, and policy campaigns, all of which are led by non-drivers. Anna began a career as an organizer and videographer, producing videos and collecting stories for the LGBT and HIV/AIDS and voting rights projects at the ACLU, as well as co-founding the union and worker-run video production company Time of Day Media. In the new book, When Driving is Not an Option, Anna shines a light on the number of people living in the U.S. who don't drive and explains how improving our transportation system with non-drivers in mind creates a better quality of life for everyone. When the needs of involuntary non-drivers are viewed as essential to how we design our transportation systems, we can all get where we need to go more easily. And these changes lead to a healthier, climate-friendly community. So please give a very warm welcome to Kia and Anna.
Thank you so much to Left Bank. First, can everybody hear me okay? Do I need to scream any louder? Okay. Thank you all so much for being here, and thank you so much for Anna for coming to St. Louis. First, how are you? How are you enjoying our beautiful state?
Thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
We'll get there. I am great. This is the first time I've really actually gotten to spend any time in St. Louis. My family has lived in southern Indiana on my dad's side for 7 generations now. So I can fly into this airport and we drive a couple hours to southern Indiana, but I never got time. So it's really, just got here this afternoon, but enjoying it so far and really excited that this event got pulled together. Thank you all for being here tonight. And thank you, Kia.
I feel like we should just do this cute thing where we pass the mic back and forth and say thank you, because I'm very excited to see you. So Anna, you and I have talked about your work at Disability Rights Washington and also this fabulous book several times. So I'm not gonna blow your mind tonight. I mostly want to just spend about 20 minutes or so talking, helping the folks in the room get to know your work, get to know you, and then you wanted to sort of flip things around a little bit. Usually we do an author Q&A, and we can have time for that as well. But just to kind of prime everyone, Anna has questions for you that will kind of launch us into how this incredible book applies in our lives in this political moment in St. Louis. But before we get there, by way of preamble, let's get to know you a little bit. Hey, we got 2 mics. All right. So you wrote this fabulous book that our mutual friend Jesse Singer said, quote, coined the defining language of the non-driver movement, which is true and badass. How did you figure out, not just that you are a non-driver, you have a very funny story about that at the beginning of the book that you're welcome to paraphrase, but that you wanted to devote your career to uplifting the needs of other people for whom driving is not an option as a Texas.
Yeah, I mean, so I have been low vision my whole life, low vision, vision impaired. This condition nystagmus makes my eyes shake all the time a little bit, and so it reduces my visual acuity, and so I don't see distance, I don't see small objects, I don't see fast moving objects very well. But I grew up in a pretty rural area, and so I just couldn't imagine, like I didn't have any models of what it meant to live in a city or live somewhere where people didn't drive where they needed to go. And then, so when I went to the DMV when I was 16, I failed the vision test. I really didn't take that seriously. I thought I would drive anyway, and had a friend try to teach me how to drive. This is the story kids are running to, and I drove her mom's truck up a tree in a parking lot. She was teaching me how to drive stick. And, it was dark, it was raining, I shouldn't have been driving. So we rode the truck. That wasn't great, but we were safe, and it scared me, and it sort of sent me on this path, being like, okay, I've got to figure out some other way to be in the world. And I moved to New York City after college, and that sort of became my I'm going to live somewhere with really good transit because that's how I'm going to cope. And that was great. For about 15 years, I was in New York City. The subway for me, and I recognize that the subway is like a not accessible system for folks who need elevators to work, right? There's not a lot of elevator access in many stations, but for me, it was great because I really did have the same kind of that frequency. You didn't have to plan when the bus was coming or when the train was coming. It was just there always. And that was great. But then I had a kid and decided that it was important to move back and be closer to family. Both my partner and my family are from Washington State. And so in 2016, 2017, we started to sort of move west and ended up in Washington in 2018. And I had a lot of fear about going back to Washington State because I just hadn't, it was like the Washington State of my childhood, which was in the woods and everyone drove everywhere. And I was like, how is this going to work? And I started working at Disability Rights Washington, which is where I work now. And that, right away, my team there, most people couldn't drive. I was like, wait a second, I'm not alone. And that started me sort of on this journey of thinking about, gosh, I have just assumed that driving was normal, but the reality is that many people can't drive. It's not just disabled folks. It's also a lot of the immigrant workers that I worked with when I was working for service worker unions and hotel worker unions. They couldn't drive or couldn't afford to drive. I done work for the ACLU around voting rights and spent time trying to find people who didn't have voter IDs in Kansas and Wisconsin. And a lot of those folks, were non-drivers as well because they didn't have driver's licenses to vote. And so the pieces kind of clicked in my brain at that point. And that's when I started doing the interviews and the work that sort of were the foundation of this book, is starting to see us as a community of people with similar interests who needed to get places but couldn't drive, couldn't afford to drive, and also people who chose not to drive, who were able to live in places where they were able to get where they needed to go, biking or transit, and those systems worked for them. And so, all together we were, there's a lot of us, 30%, right? Probably, if not more in some communities. And if we see ourselves as that constituency, we can push for change and have sort of political power to do that and start to build it.
So, immigrants.
Yeah.
Kids,
Yes.
Folks under the
Yeah.
legal driving age.
Yeah.
Folks with disabilities that make driving impossible. When you add all these groups up, you said it's about 30%,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
Of the population,
Yes.
of America.
Yes.
That number is a number, even working in the field that I do, I had never heard before I read this book, right? So why do you think it took you writing this book for that number to exist? And why does it matter? Why is it important to track and know how much of our population is a non-driver for whom driving is not an option? I just love your title, so I'm going to say it 40 times.
I mean, I think we're often split off into these little constituencies, right? It's like children have their own transportation needs, and we're going to create school bus systems to make sure that they can get where they need to go if we fund those systems, which I know is a question in many communities right now. We're going to have seniors have, perhaps they have to move to nursing homes, and that's how they have their transportation needs met once they can't drive. Disabled people, right? You have, paratransit, and you can qualify for that. But together we're not, seen as a constituency. And you think about who is left out, right? It's immigrant communities. Non-drivers are more likely to be low income, more likely to be people of color. more likely to live in tribal communities, right? And so it's people who have less political power. And so that's also part of it too. Yeah, there was a second point that I wanted to make, but I don't remember what the second part of the question was.
I don't remember.
Okay.
We'll come back to the
We'll get there,
Q&A. I mean,
yeah.
it's such a profound observation that, modality and power have intersections, and that we need to talk about these things as constituencies and as groups, that we belong to.
I just remembered the second point. And it actually has to do with the frame you use about car dependency. And in your podcast, you're always, what's the question you ask at the end? What have you done today to
What is one thing you have done today to help end car dependency? Let me know. I got a whole time.
Yes, it's a great tagline. And I think it's a really useful frame because we as non-drivers, like in a car dependent community, our interests are very similar. Like we are, because car dependency doesn't work for us, we can be aligned in pushing to change it. And that's the power. But I think it is like sort of this counterpoint to car dependency. And that's why it's useful. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I'm sure some people are sitting here thinking like, well, but I know a lot of folks who like have disabilities who do rely on this stuff. And one of the misconceptions that you quash in this book, of the many misconceptions that you quash in this book, is that like the disability community is a monolith. Right? It's not. I kind of wanted to invite you to say if there was any other misconception in this book that you could wave a magic wand and no one in the world would believe this myth would be busted. What would it be? What's of all the things that you bring up in this book about the needs of non-drivers and what non-drivers don't need, what do you think you would want to dismantle today?
I mean, I think one thing that has sort of I have come to accept and is that in most of our country, because it is so car dependent, especially outside of like the wealthiest places that have good transit, good sidewalks, biking and rolling infrastructure, for non-drivers, for most of us, the way we get around is asking for rides from friends and family or, social services and relying on those. And that, I think, isn't something that people who are sort of choice non-drivers have really reckoned with. And I think it's hard because there's also this assumption that that's an easy ask. And even if you have a deep social network, every single person who I know who's an involuntary non-driver who has to rely on favors for rides doesn't like asking. And so that the system is working somehow in providing what people need. And I recognize that like sometimes we emphasize independence too much and that it's okay to be codependent and it's okay to be interdependent on each other and lean on each other for things, but to not be able to leave where you live without being able to ask permission, I think is like that is really profound. And I'm not sure people understand that who haven't experienced it.
Yeah, like what does that do to you in terms of like your emotional life and your social life? That's fascinating, and thank you for sharing that with all of us who haven't had that experience.
Yeah,
it's such a privilege to get to be vulnerable with us.
Yeah, no, and I think it is true, and like for at the sort of surface level, it's like okay, you get depressed when you don't get to go do social things because you feel guilty asking for like a ride home late at night. But like at a safety level, if your whole social network is your family and there's something going on there that's not great, like, you hear stories, right? And it's just not like that is part of it too. And so that's why we need to have other systems that just don't rely on that social network. That's why we need transit. That's why we need walkable communities. That's why we need, locations near enough to us that we can get to without having to drive. So that's why I think there's this sort of that's why it's so important.
Beautiful. So we talked about non-drivers. We talked about choice non-drivers, but you do talk to drivers, my old regular drivers in this book, and especially in your work through the Week Without Driving campaign. And you challenge drivers to walk a mile in our shoes, bike a mile in our shoes, borrow some rides in our shoes. The metaphor is right up. But why don't you tell this group, for folks who don't know, what is the Week Without Driving campaign? And how do you think it's helped it shape perspectives across the US around the non-driver experience?
Yeah, so the Week Without Driving came out of was this idea that came out of my work with labor. We've done a lot of work at Disability Rights Washington documenting the stories of non-drivers. And we, created a story map and we created a white paper and then a bunch of videos. And I wanted some way for elected officials to understand that these stories were, connected to people in their communities. But it was fall 2021 and the pandemic was still, we were really in the thick of it. And so I couldn't partner up. I wanted to sort of have people walk a day in the shoes of a non-driver. But we couldn't do these partnerships in person. And so I'm like, well, how can we get elected officials to understand this? And so we asked them and we challenged some elected officials to try to go for a whole week without driving themselves. And it's not a week without a car. I think it's an important distinction. You could still ask for rides. You could still pay for rides if that's within what you can afford. But it's really trying to understand how non-drivers in your community get around. And I guarantee in every community, even in really rural communities, there are non-drivers. And they're probably relying on rides from people. And so if that's your community, that's what you maybe need to do, because there's not going to be, a bus that goes near you. But so that's what it came out of. Started in 2021. We did it in Washington State for 2 years. It grew a lot. And then we kept on getting calls from other communities being like, can we do it here? And I wanted to be like, yes, but my funding, my job is based in Washington State. So we partnered with America Walks, who does national advocacy, and they hired an amazing organizer, Ruth Rosas, who has since 2023 brought Week Without Driving to a national sort of level. And so this is our third year now. Last year we had participation from all 50 states. We had over 500 local organizations as co-hosts. And it's really cool to see what different communities do. The Toledo Transit Agency, TARTA, wrapped a bus for Week Without Driving and did a bunch of promotional stuff. Other communities have done bingo. Some transit agencies have done free rides for the week. And then, importantly, we've seen a lot of reflection from elected officials and others in like transportation leadership on what they've learned. Just this week, actually, we passed a piece of legislation in Washington State to get transit riders on transit boards, and the person who was running it for us, as she did the final vote call, was talking about Week Without Driving and how it influenced what she understood about what she didn't know about transit and why it was important to have people who ride transit involved with that government. So it's cool. It's been a fun it's coming up this year, September 29th through October 5th are the dates, and it's weekwithoutdriving.org, and I have stickers. So I forgot. They're in my bag, and come get one. So actually I'll pass them around.
Yeah. I mean, has anyone in this room done Week Without Driving? We did it in St. Louis last year.
Yeah.
I know. It's a campaign where you post on the internet and that. Obviously, come on. I know one room person, but I will say, in St. Louis, I always wish that more elected officials would participate in Week Without Driving. I think our mayor did last, a photo op, and she didn't do the whole week. It just
That's okay. I mean, it's hard, and I think the people who try it as elected officials, and then they can only do one thing, and then they think the rest of the time about it. They're like, I'm not doing it right now. That's just as valuable. Those other trips when they're driving somewhere and being like, gosh, my kid couldn't do soccer if I didn't have a car, right? Yeah. What does that mean for families who can't afford cars?
Absolutely. Soccer is one. Yeah. But I mean, one group of politicians who I think is very unlikely to ever do Week Without Driving, unfortunately, is our current federal government. We just gotta say it. I know you were at the Moving Missouri Forward Summit this week. That's what brought you into our state, and we got to piggyback off of it here in St. Louis, happily, which was hosted by our dear friends at Local Motion Columbia. They're the Trailnet of Columbia, for those who don't know. And while they were there, they found out that they had a $500,000 grant canceled by the Trump administration that was supposed to help do a transit plan for the entire Columbia region. It's a massive setback for that area. It's huge. And it, I think, I don't know if it cast a pall over the event or if it changed the tone of the event at all, but I was curious from your perspective as a keynote speaker at that event, how has the conversation about the non-driver movement shifted since the Trump era began? How has it dampened your spirits? Has it energized you? Where is this hitting, and how is this message hitting people who are pretty scared and losing materially from this administration's priorities?
Yeah, I mean, it's really scary. Like they were hoping, I didn't know, they have 90-minute headways on their buses there. Like 90 minutes. Can you imagine trying to get somewhere? Like, and so this is hopefully going to help them move beyond that. So yeah, you know, I come at it in two places. One, like 100%, there are grants that were going, federal grants and federal funding that were going for local efforts to do transit, transit funding, transit infrastructure, you know, pedestrian infrastructure, reconnecting communities grants that are heartbreaking to see that money go away. And it's going to take so much to rebuild that. Also, just so much public health, you know, work that was happening. None of the work. I mean, that all of that is heartbreaking. I think what I have taken a little bit of hope from, and this is a little bit from Transportation from America and the way they framed it is, for so long, so much of our federal transportation funding, right, has been going towards expanding highways and expanding road capacity. And at the end of the day, all that expansion actually actively makes it harder for non-drivers to get around, because it makes it harder for us to cross the street. It induces more travel. It makes the distances between things further away because it's easier for people who can drive to just drive. And so, you know, the local shops, right? We see this a lot in rural America, like where my family's from in southern Indiana, there is no more local economy. The population hasn't changed, but the highways got built and everyone drives 40 miles into the bigger city to do all their shopping, right? And so, I mean, it's more complicated than that, but that's part of it. And so I think we have the opportunity, now that all the good funding is sort of going away from the federal government, to really, at least, you know, in my experience too, at the state level, we would get bought off at our, you know, state transportation budget conversations. We didn't want the new highway expansions. Those are still happening, but they'd be like, oh, we're going to throw in like $5 million for this bike ped work. And we'd be like, okay, well, it's more money than we've ever had for bike ped work. So we'll sign on for the transportation plan. I think we have the opportunity as advocates to now just say no, you know, to really fight back against all of the highway funding, because we're not getting any of the good stuff anymore. So that's where I am at, both at the state level and the federal level. I'm like, we need to stop being okay with the little pieces that are just, I mean, tiny amounts of money compared to what they're spending on road capacity expansion. So.
Absolutely. I mean, I was interviewing someone today in Philly, who was a council person who they had just gotten the city to agree to extend a pilot that would give a lot of non-drivers access to free transit. It is basically the poorest fifth of Philadelphians, and they send them unlimited transit passes in the mail. They don't have to apply. They're like, you already proved to us that you need this by applying for food stamps and Medicare and all that stuff. Here you go out into the world, 20,000 people, right? And the way that this person framed it was like, this is the city giving a direct subsidy to the transit agency when the federal government is about to cut us off at the knees, you know, and like, we need to stand on our own 2 feet. We need to recognize that like, this is the moment to say, this matters to us, and we're not going to say like, oh, no one's giving us the money. We raised the money, we need to take care of us. And it really, really fired me up. And, you know, we're at an interesting moment in St. Louis too. We got a new mayor like 2 days ago, something like that, right? Yeah. So I'm curious if someone who has been traveling around the country for a year now, talking to all kinds of communities, what would you say to our new mayor, to any mayor of any city, about how to start thinking and prioritizing the needs of non-drivers?
What I've taken most from doing this work is not so much that I know the answers at all, but what I'm even in Washington State, what I'm most interested in is how do we get non-drivers, and in particular involuntary non-drivers, into the rooms where decisions are getting made. And so, you know,
I would say,
yeah. So for us, you know, that's led to, in Washington State, rather than focusing on transportation projects so much as an organization, we focused on capacity building, and capacity building at a policy level. So like this I was mentioning, getting transit rider representatives voting seats on transit boards. We're doing that through a piece of state legislation. And that, hopefully the governor signs it, you know, will mean that we'll have those different voices in the room. It's still only going to be 2 votes. It's not a majority, but like right now, the transit boards are made up of elected officials, and those elected officials are too busy to ride transit. And they're making decisions about transit, right, without ever using the system. The other piece of legislation that we got passed, but waiting for our governor, hopefully not veto, is to stop requiring driver's licenses for jobs when driving is an essential function. So, yeah, because we see all these transit agency jobs, transportation planning jobs, lots of jobs. where it's not, and I get there's jobs where people need to have a driver's license or a commercial license, right? But there's so many jobs where it's just like shorthand for being a responsible human being, and it excludes a lot of people. And we need to start making it possible for, for those voices to be in the room. So that's only like a little tiny piece of what it takes to get more, agencies that reflect our population, right? There's so many other barriers as well, but it's a little piece we can chip away at and trying to get more of those perspectives.
Well, speaking of perspectives in the room, I thought this might be a nice moment to transition, that's what we're looking to your questions for this audience about what they want for St. Louis and how this message applies there. I have your prompts here if you would like them.
Yeah.
You probably have them.
And I think we'll run a mic too so we can get people,
I
and
think
you can give people stickers if they share. Yeah. Incentives. So the question I started doing at the beginning of all my presentations actually, and this came out of doing a presentation last year for Federal Highways, where I was really nervous because I was like, I don't think they want to hear what I'm gonna say. But I asked, and this is like a 500 person Zoom call. I asked them to put in the chat who they knew in their families or in their lives or them who were non-drivers, voluntary or involuntary, and what their experience of getting around their communities were. And that chat just blew up. And it was so affirming because it was just like, I was so worried that no one in that space was going to get what I was talking about. So my question for you all is who you know in your life, whether that's a family member or a friend, someone in your social circle who can't drive, can't afford to drive, chooses not to drive, and what their experiences of getting around St. Louis are.
I saw a hand right here, go right up.
I've been a non-driver since last May after a car accident, and through the divorce, my credit score went down so low that I wouldn't qualify for a loan. So I figured, how am I going to be able to get around St. Louis? So I was in Kirkwood at that time, and it was easy enough to get around, but I couldn't get to the grocery store. I couldn't get to like a lot of like basic necessities. Then I moved to an apartment in Clayton, and within Clayton, I have 2 metro stations. They only went halfway to downtown. So I'd get stopped at Grand, and then that Grand, I'd have to figure out how to get from Grand to the downtown station. Once I got to the downtown station, there's only one track that was going the other way, and I don't have like a phone half the time, right? So then I'm like dependent on just the train times and just the bus times. I was at a bus stop once for an hour and 15 minutes to on a bus and a running bus stop, and they still have their phones, right? Because they just told you to wait. Yeah, just wait. So like I'm like grateful my mom has like an Uber when I'm not being like bratty about it. I'll use a family Uber account, like oh I can use this because that is like a benefit, that is a luxury. But in terms of getting anywhere outside of like Clayton itself is walkable, and I can get my groceries, I can get to the doctor, I can get to the dentist, I have all my basic needs within walking distance. If I'm out of Clayton, it's very hard to get back to Clayton without an Uber.
Thanks for sharing that.
Anyone else? All right, I found that first. So.
I want to start by saying that I've never felt so seen than by you right now, Anna, because I have a disability. I've had it my whole life. I've never had a license. I've had 3 permits because I passed the written test, and then I just couldn't drive. And I grew up in SoCal and in Irvine, and I like honestly the psychological damage of like constantly needing to be dependent on people has been really, I'm realizing later, now that I live in a city where there is some public transportation, it's standing out to me. But I'm new to St. Louis, 2023 is when I moved, and I don't really leave like South City, so I try to do everything there. But I have also vision issues and a service dog, and because I have a disability, it limits how much I can work. So I'm low income, and it's just frustrating because either the buses are late, they don't come, or they're early. And even if they see me running to catch them with my service dog, they drive off. Or they see me with the service dog and they're like, we don't want a dog today, and they drive off. So the most frustrating thing for me has been infrequent public transportation and unreliable public transportation or unavailable at all. And then I need to, in the most desperate moments, like if I need to get my dog to the vet or if I need to go to the hospital or whatever, I have to pay for a Lyft or an Uber. And I just can't afford to do that a lot. So that's kind of my experience is sometimes I need to spend money that I don't have to just get something essential to happen.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah. Yeah.
We can't hear you. Well, when we're talking about about local license and having a permit, people with housing insecurity have two different things. You need to have two different forms of identification in order to get like an ID. So if you're in homeless insecurity, if you're homeless or having housing insecurity, it's really hard to get an ID because you don't have electrical bills, you don't have the two pieces of paperwork in order to get identification. So then we're looking at people with disabilities and we're looking at how accessible it is for them to A, get housing and B, get transportation. If you can't get a house, how are you going to get a car?
You know?
No, and then I think what both of you shared was really interesting to me, and I don't know St. Louis super well, but just the geographic limitation then of what your world becomes. And I've noticed that in Seattle, it's really different than New York, where the subway system was so extensive and I felt like the whole city was mine. Seattle, I don't feel that way because even though there is buses that go out, the time it takes is so long. I mean, in Seattle, you can drive pretty much anywhere in 20 minutes, but it's 2+ hours to get those places on a bus, right? And I'm sure it's similar here. And so my world really is my neighborhood, which is where it's a more affordable neighborhood, meaning that there's not a lot of services. And then you just, and I get frustrated about your grocery stores, for example, or lack of affordable grocery stores. So yeah, it is the thing. Yeah.
So you want to move on to your next?
Yes,
question, or-
yeah. So
Share afterwards.
yes, yeah, and come talk to me after. I mean, one thing after writing this book, I'm like, I really want to do another book now that I've had the opportunity to do more national travel. Because this book there's some stories from other parts, but it really is grounded in Washington State, which is similar to a lot of the rest of the country. But it's cool to get to hear your story. So my next question is really around week without driving, and for those of you who normally do drive, this is your opportunity to share. If you were to take on a week without driving, could you talk about is there a trip or trips that would be extremely difficult for you to take without being able to drive? What those trips would be, or what you would do instead, what you might give up, who you might have to ask, what that would feel like, or reflecting on maybe what privilege you have, where that's like, you could live in a place that has great transit and great sidewalks and lots of services right there. So reflecting on sort of what your experience would be. Anyone want to share?
Sorry. I used to work here.
So in particular, I've lived here 11 years. I'm not from St. Louis. The first, say, 8 or 9 years I lived here, I lived in the city limits, and it was hard getting around the city because I didn't have a car at the time. I only acquired one last year because my father passed. But I had difficulty getting around the city living in the city, but I made it work. St. Louis, a lot of the neighborhoods, though they're not as interconnected as they could be, they're pretty walkable. And you learn the routes on your bike, back streets and things like that. You become pretty savvy. But one thing definitely that I took kind of for granted was being able to just get down to South City from where I live, which is Clayton. Similar to you, there's 2 train stations there, Clayton walkable. That part's great. I get to the Central West End pretty easily from there, and places like that are connected via the light rail. But getting to South City, I was constantly being invited to events by friends in South City, and it is an absolute freaking nightmare getting from Clayton to South City. People have no idea how long it takes, and the multiple connections. And oftentimes I would find myself, if I was really motivated, I would just get on my bike and just straight up ride my bike across the city from Clayton and say, screw transit, because it just wasn't worthwhile to do all this crazy loop-de-loop stuff that I had to do to get there. So that's my experience with that.
Did you ride the Grand Bus?
Now, I usually go
The Grand Bus is the best shot to South City.
Blue Line to Shrewsbury to Chippewa bus, or
Yeah.
something like that.
It's like a 6-stop plan. The Uber from Clayton to South City is between $38 and $42 for like one way. You know, so when you look at it, it's like that's a cheap gas to get halfway to my stop, you know?
Anybody else want to speak to this question? I think we have a lot of non-drivers visuals in this.
Yeah.
To be honest. I mean, our license, I'm a driver. Yeah. Like 10% of the time, I would say. Like, but I do drive. I have a car and things like that. And for me, the biggest barrier to why I am not the most like, why that 10% still happens is at night. I do not feel safe in any neighborhood in St. Louis at night as a woman, in particular. There's not a street light here. The way that we develop our city is really challenging, and that would be the biggest barrier for me. And also my addiction to Trader Joe's. Only in the county. Anybody else?
Yeah, no, and I think, I mean, the nighttime thing that you point out is so important. If you think about, people who have children or other caregiving responsibilities, right? Really hard. I was just doing a conversation like this in Arizona, and someone was talking to me about their experience there in Bisbee, Arizona, which is this former copper mining town. There's this huge open copper mining pit. They have to haul their own water because the city water is contaminated. And I was like, man, I hadn't even thought about what it would take to try to haul water without being able to drive. Like, yeah. So I think, yeah, it really was like, oh man, I am lucky to be able to, turn on my tap, water I can drink. So yeah, there's lots of pieces to this. And thank you for sharing, your all's experience and yeah. And
Anyone else want to throw in before we go to our final question from Anna to you? And then you can ask your questions to Anna. I got one. You get stickers if you get your whole row gets stickers.
the peer pressure.
I guess like one thing for me, I mean, I go to school at St. Louis University. If I don't have a car, I can't get home because they shut down the buses in like the county or Chesterfield area around 5 years ago. If you live in that area, I mean, if you're like one bus lane in the north of Chesterfield, but apart from that, you are forced to have a car or bike. Chesterfield isn't the best to bike around, so you are forced to then go to the dealership, buy a car. There's no other way of living in like that area of St. Louis.
Yeah. No, and I think, in this conversation and what I've heard from elected leaders who have done the challenges, even the folks who normally like to find places or take transit, like there are those trips that are just, not feasible, super unsafe without a car. And what does that say about, the fact that we know that there are non-drivers and what happens to their mobility in these spaces? And so, having that time to reflect and make us think about, we're not going to fix all those gaps right away, but how do we think about them and how do we start to consider that we're not, meeting all those needs?
I think we
Open it up to
one more
questions.
question.
Oh,
No, we're good.
Yeah,
Okay, we're good. Then
yeah.
let's open it up to your questions. All right.
Okay, so I am also, I'm a non-driver. I depend on my driver. And I noticed, I have my phone in St. Louis. So a lot of issues around public transportation, particularly in an area like St. Louis, is related to a lot of racism and the way we uniquely do segregation in St. Louis. And I guess the question, and just noticing who we have in the room, how do we open up these conversations? Because I know I'm not the only non-driver that looks like me. So how do we open up these conversations to bring in people of color who would see value in this work that you're doing, particularly in a uniquely segregated space like St. Louis, in order to expand, or to de-expand, it's a word, our need for car dependency. when we have neighborhoods that are set up uniquely designed to feel unsafe, to not have because they market and retrobate Black people coming up to us County for parking, but not for people that need the groceries. So how do we do that and bring in more people of color for this movement that's very important?
Thank you. That is, I think, the key question here, right? Because, yeah, it is. I mean, when you think about why we don't fund transit, right, or where transit isn't allowed to be, right, that is because of racism. And people see, all the stigma around, oh, I don't ride the bus isn't safe, right? That's all because of that stigma. And I was just in Columbia, right? We were there, they have a public transit system, but the university, and that's the 90-minute headways, the university has a separate public transit system for the students. And if they actually, had the same system, they'd have a lot more ridership. Transit headways could be much better for the folks who need that public transit, but there's so much stigma right around that public transit that they're separate systems. And I worry that's where we're headed as a country right now.
She does it right now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because, I mean, in the same in Seattle, we have all, the Google and the Amazon and Microsoft run their own buses, right? Company buses, right? Because they don't feel safe on public transit, right? And right now they're actually lobbying to be able to use the bus lanes for their buses. And it's like, no, you don't have to do that. You should be using public transit. You should be paying into the system and you should be making public transit better. But I think it's also right about, housing segregation and housing affordability. And when I know less about St. Louis, but in Washington State, where there is public transit right now, those areas tend to be, because our cities have gotten so expensive, we've had so much population growth and so much wealth coming, that people are priced out. And they're priced out of where there is transit, they're priced out of where there is sidewalks, and they're priced into areas where there aren't those options. Or they're priced back to living with family that are, really in rural areas. And then what happens? So, yeah. Housing is such a big piece of this and land use. And we can't, I guess, transit is part of the equation, right? But the other half of it is where you live and where you can afford to live and where your community lives and what services are there, right? And what services aren't there. And so then we got to work on both sides. What services are there and also how much leasing there is in your area. I mean, the thing that I always make sure I emphasize to people is North Side St. Louis, there are census tracts that have some of the lowest rates of household car ownership in the United States of America. And we don't talk about that as a region as much as we should. It's invisibilized. It's a lot of elders. It's a lot of very low income people. And they have also some of the highest rates of traffic violence in the city. Those are the deadliest roads that are all up there. I mean, when you asked your first question about non-drivers in our city, I always think about, we all heard the name Shirley Howard in this room. Shirley Howard was a mom. You retweeted her. So I know you know who it is. Was a mom on the north side of 4 kids. She had a seizure disorder. She wasn't able to drive. She was pushing her kid in a stroller on the street during that ice storm we all had in January. You all remember that? And the sidewalk was so frozen over with ice that she had to walk in the bike lane and she was hit and killed. Those are the stories that, that's why I do what I do. And I certainly, you're right, it is the question. It's how do we center those people who are being most impacted? We can't be, you're right, that's who should be in this room and that's who should be in these policy decisions and that's who should be making. Yeah. It's work, right, to be like, okay, we have this big coalition of non-drivers, but it's usually the voluntary non-drivers that get to be in groups, right? That have the time and the resources and whatever, it's in spaces where they're comfortable. And how do we flip that and make it a space where there's actually leadership from the involuntary non-drivers, people who don't have the choice to drive? And that is, I think part of it is about stepping back if you're a voluntary non-driver and allowing other people to step up. But how do we facilitate that and fund that and make sure that agencies are funding that? And that's a fight right now for sure. I will say, Anna, you do one of the best jobs of this of anyone I've ever interviewed. The first time I ever interviewed Anna was because she put together this video that was featuring the perspectives of non-drivers. And I was like, this is the most diverse video I've ever seen. This is the most platforming of the right people I've ever seen. I was really, really impressed. You continue to impress me. So. And I think we need to platform more people, right? And I want other people, like, I wish, other people need to write books too, right? And like, be in this. So, yeah.
Other
I
questions?
hope you write the next book.
Any other questions?
This road is stickers.
Thanks. I was wondering if you had any suggestions for dealing with, city administration and police department that has no interest in it. It was crossing the street, but the cars are running.
Yeah, no, I have one of those lights by my house, and it's frustrating, right? Because it is, you never know if it's going to stop or not stop. I mean, I get frustrated. There's so much funding in this like traffic safety space. There's like all these conferences about traffic safety, and it's all about. I mean, you can talk about there's people who think enforcement's the solution or street design, and I want us to focus more on land use and reducing driving and reducing car dependency. Like, what would it take so that people don't have to drive as far? I mean, because the street by my house, right? People have been priced out of Seattle, and so people are commuting in long distances for jobs, and they want to not spend all that time driving because they have to commute a really long way. And so, to reduce the speed on that street means that they will have a longer commute. And so, how do we make sure that we have more housing, more affordable housing in the places close to where the services and resources and jobs are? I think that's and reduce the amount we all need to drive. That will reduce some of this. But that's a big term, long term change. But that's how I like to think about it.
We have time for one or two more before we transition to a little signing, and you all buy on this.
So I may not be able to answer this question correctly. So friends with Kia who may then be able to do better. But when we talk about non-drivers, that's sometimes put in a separate category from people who cannot drive due to a mobility disability. And I know doing work in St. Louis City, groups like Paraquad and some others advocate for better buses and better vans to get them from point A to point B. But when getting them to talk about transportation in general, which may mean better sidewalks or infrastructure for them to get around, they seem not to be able to grasp that part of the conversation yet. So in your opinion and wisdom, the work that you've done, how do we begin to pull both sides together?
Yeah, that's a deep and complicated question. I've seen it right in Washington State too, where because our communities are so car dependent, and I think it comes down to that, right? For many folks, like their only option to be able to leave the home is to get someone to come pick them up, right? And whether that's a paratransit vehicle or a volunteer driver, and for some people that's gonna be the best option. I think other people, like if there was a sidewalk and it was a comfortable and place to be that was smooth and the ramps were there and there was a bus shelter, the wait wasn't too long, like maybe this route could be an option. But it might not always be, and I think we need to make sure that we have both systems available. But we also, there's for many of the younger folks I've worked with too, who are paratransit users, there's so much frustration in the delays because you have to pre-schedule, and I'm not sure what the system is here, but 24-hour pre-scheduling. If you're trying to go out with friends, that's really hard, right? Or those plans change. And so, if they could have better fixed route transit access, they would. I think there's a lot of tech money though going into this. Oh, we can have on-demand paratransit, and that's going to work. And systems are trying it, but it just doesn't scale. Like we've had in my neighborhood in Seattle, they've been having this via the transit pilot now since 2018, where you can use an app to call a minivan that comes and picks you up, and everybody can use it. But the more people that use it, the longer the waits. And so, instead of having to schedule 24 hours in advance, maybe you're only waiting 45 minutes, which is better. But the more people who use it, it doesn't scale the same way. So, yeah, it's a challenge. It's a challenge to have those conversations. And I think there's also the other piece of it too is that many people don't have access to mobility chairs, wheelchairs, power chairs that meet their needs. Or have a way of transporting those easily. And so, making sure that in the industry isn't great about making sure people have chairs that are replaced and they break, right? Like the delays can be really excessive. And so, sometimes it could be a matter of getting access to a chair, but then some of those chairs are hard to get on and off buses, and if bus drivers aren't trained, like all those, so it's complicated. And we do have the same tension, right, in Washington State. People wanting paratransit to be better, but also, that is expensive, and we also want fixed rapid transit people who want that option. But I can talk to you after. I don't know. It's complicated. Yeah.
Maybe we want to do one more question. Anybody want to have the last word? Kristen, all right.
Yes, thank you. I'll try to form my thoughts and my questions carefully, but in terms of also, we've been talking about bridging gaps, bridging divides of various types. In terms of like advocating for changes that we want to see, I'm curious what you think about like incrementalism versus like a radical idea. Like a lot of the wide, dangerous roads that we experienced in St. Louis were widened. Buildings were demolished, or at least partially demolished, to widen these streets, right? To solve the congestion of gridlocked traffic. And now people are going 60 miles per hour because they have all the space in the world because we've lost this density. So, I want to be like, let's put those buildings back. Let's put trees where all those parked cars that we need there are. Like, do you have any advice in terms of advocating for incremental changes? Like, all of a sudden this spring, there were just speed bumps everywhere. So that's great because it's slowing cars down, but I'm worried that if we only kind of grasp for the crumbs and don't think bigger, right, and introduce those ideas into the conversation, even though we're demanding what is possible in the near term, then we're not going to serve everyone in our city and also meet the challenges of climate change and all of these big issues that need big solutions.
Yeah. This reminds me of this realization I had last year. So I've been working for like 7 years now on this particular, we build our light rail along our highway in the median, and then expect pedestrians to cross like unsignalized on-ramps and off-ramps to get to those light rail stations. Not ideal. So we're trying this one particular location. It's just awful. We're trying to get them to put some signals in, at least on these on and off ramps. Maybe close one or two of them too would be great. And years and years of advocacy, not getting anywhere because it's the state DOT, and then it's this like regional transit agency, and then it's the local transit agency, and it's the local DOT, and all the jurisdiction is a mess, and nobody is taking responsibility for it. I mean, we got some like, some paint, some like little bit of, but nothing major. Then this apartment complex got built, and there's 1,000 units of housing going in right there, and then another 1,400 just on the other side of the intersection. And suddenly the developers got involved because they realized that it's an apartment complex that's not going to have a lot of parking, so most of their folks are going to be using transit. And this developer had this meltdown about the people that are living there having to walk, across this on ramp and just expecting cars to stop for them, and how that wasn't going to work. And I was in a call with the DOT where she sort of had this fit about this, and it changed the conversation completely. Not because she was a developer, but because of the number of new residents that were going to be in this area. And what was then, it was sort of a pass-through area, right? Like people weren't considering a place where people were, and suddenly there were going to be constituents there. And so it made me recognize that, maybe there's connections between the housing affordability work we're doing and trying to get more housing built in some of these, more industrial areas and, abandoned lots, like how that could change the conversation around what's possible and what streets are for. So it doesn't totally answer your question, but it gave me a okay, this is actually a way to get more transformational change because it changes who is there in some ways.
Beautiful. All right. Thank you all so much for coming. Thank you so much to Anna. Can we give it up for her one more time? Signing books and giving away stickers and talking about all these issues. So thank you so much. And thank you to Love Bank.
Thank you.
Thanks, Left Bank.